Hey everybody, Something Gadget Guy here, and I've been getting a lot of questions about how I edit photos for Instagram. Apparently, some of you guys like the kind of stuff that I post up there, so I thought I would do just a quick look at how I like to edit photos, especially when we're talking about a service that cuts all of our photos into squares, and then also compresses a lot of information out of the photos that come from our amazing 16 megapixel, 20 megapixel cameras. To start, one of the most important things that I take a look at before sharing a photo on Instagram is really just the photo composition itself. I'm very particular about what photos I want to share. Taking a look at this photo right here, this was part of a nature hike that I took during my KumbaCam review, and when we zoom in on this photo, we get some really nice detail in these tiny little blue flowers, but this is an extremely hard line of high contrast shadow right here. I don't particularly like how that sets up really bright parts of the flower here where we start to clip and lose detail, and really dark parts of these flowers here where it's really hard to pull information out of all of that shadow. Unfortunately, we just don't have enough resolution to make this a macro pic of this tiny little bug right here, because that could have been a really cool shot. I just couldn't focus close enough to these little flowers and this tiny little bug. So even though we've got a really pleasant scene right here, I've got some nice shallow depth of field, these flowers are kind of popping in front of their background, this is likely a photo that I would not share on Instagram just because I don't particularly like the exposure here, and I don't particularly like this high contrast scene. It's really hard to edit for that. Catching a similar setup where now we're dealing with sunset light as opposed to that last photo was taken in sunrise light. We zoom in here, these little flower buds are very nicely exposed. We've got tons of detail here, these little hairy, wispy parts of these flowers, these buds that are just starting to unfurl, that are just starting to bloom. And when we zoom back out, this background is nicely shaded. There's not a lot distracting from these little flowers here, and the entire flower is in very good light. Now, if I'm getting really nitpicky, if I zoom in here, I don't particularly like how the lighting is hitting some of these flowers in the background. You can see the green of this blurry area right here is starting to encroach on this little green sliver right here, but thankfully I've got this nice bold popping red that I can use to kind of break up the issues with this predominantly green background. And as you can see, when we zoom in, we've got a nice little visual setup here. We've got this leading line here from the stem, which kind of draws the eye into these flowers, and I'll of course be cropping this roughly to the rule of thirds, and we can talk about how the different crops on this will make the flowers feel a little more cramped or a little more open depending on where we hit that Instagram square setup. Gonna go in, gonna hit my little share icon here, scroll down to Insta. And now we get our little square composition window. As we start moving things around, you'll notice these little guidelines popping up. I'm a big believer of the rule of thirds. There's a common photography notion that putting your subject dead center into a photo makes that a little less visually appealing. So even though this isn't a widescreen photo, I do try to keep what I think is the most visually interesting part of the frame at least on one of these 1/3 lines. And this is where I was talking about, we can make this feel really open and airy. We get a little blue sky here. We get some of the background that's not too distracting because it's nicely blurry thanks to depth of field. This leads us into this little stalk, but the flowers are nicely popping off of a predominantly shadowed background. If I push the flowers to this other line, we get less of the sky. So there's less of that, like I was saying, that could be kind of distracting with the blue. But as this line is leading the flowers in this direction, it starts, in my opinion, it starts to feel a little claustrophobic. It starts to feel a little cramped, like these flowers don't have anywhere to go if we push them all the way over here to the side. That's sort of pushing the flowers, and the flowers are leading into what feels like a wall on the edge of this photo here. So I'm gonna keep these flowers on this side of the screen, but what I'm gonna do, because like I said, I think that this is maybe a little too distracting, and I really wanna see, unfortunately, Instagram, even though they've bumped up to 1080p photo viewing, it's still pretty compressed. So all of that really delicious little tiny textural detail is kind of lost. So I'm going to zoom this in a little bit more so that we can see all of that detail. I'm gonna put the flower, this largest of the blooms, leading right into the intersection on this rule of thirds guideline here. So technically it's kind of center punched, but we've got this right here on the third line. All of these flowers are sort of right in between this 1/3 line right here. So now we have the flower sort of suggesting movement from right to left. I think that's really visually interesting. We still have that little bit of a lead in from the stem. We have some sense of the rest of this being a nature scene in the background, that this wasn't just like a flower that I took a picture of in my living room, but the flowers are still popping predominantly off of that shadowed background. And I think that makes for a really interesting composition. Now that gets us into the actual editing of the photo. I am not a big fan of filters. You start going through, and a lot of these sort of preset filters, I find them to be inconsistent performers. You kind of have to tab through, and you can get really used to, oh, I know Aiden does sort of a washed out, lower saturation and lower contrast image. And that's cool, but I don't find that I've ever landed on one of these preset filters and thought, yes, that's exactly how I want to upload this photo. So instead, I like to come into the individual editing settings. And as Instagram has evolved, we've actually gotten some very, very cool editing tools. This is now starting to compete with some of the best mobile photo editing software that we have on the market. Even Snapseed, I kind of prefer the tools and the way that they're implemented here on Instagram. I just wish Instagram would let us upload rectangles and higher resolution rectangles. Going through all of these, I am a very big fan of light touch. Making tiny little tweaks across all of these settings can help pop this photo a little bit better than if we make like one really big, like, hey, I really want to juice the saturation. But we're going to go through. So brightness is exactly what brightness sounds like. We can make the photo brighter. We can make the photo darker. Now, we know that smartphones have a tendency to oversaturate and overexpose. So I tend to play a lot of my photos just a little bit darker. If I can't underexpose when shooting the photo, I like to underexpose when I'm editing. So I'm going to tweak this just a little bit so we can pull a little bit more detail out of the reds, because reds are very tricky for any digital sensor to expose for properly. And this gives us just a bit more contrast, you can see, with some of those finer textural details on these leaves here. So we're gonna hit OK there. I also really like contrasty shots. If I'm guilty of overusing a certain setting, it's usually contrast. But we're gonna bump this up. So what it's gonna do is it's gonna make the darker parts of the scene a little bit darker. It's gonna make the brighter parts of the scene a little bit brighter. And this is probably the largest adjustment I'm going to make throughout all of these tweaks to this photo. And you can see now we've lost even more detail in this background shadowed area. The dark green here is playing with the lighter green here a little bit less. There's a little bit less crossover, so I like that as an adjustment. I'm gonna go ahead and hit OK. And this is one of the newest editing tools in the Instagram lineup, and this is Structure. It takes a second to reprocess the image. And what this does is that it sort of exaggerates some of the line details that we might see in a particular color. It's a little different than just sharpening in sort of a masking filter kind of way, so we can exaggerate it. And you can see how now all of this is sort of a hyper exaggerated, like this doesn't really look like that in real life, but it also makes our bokeh in the background a little bit busier, a little bit linier. So I don't necessarily like hitting Structure too hard, but again, a little judicious use, because we know Instagram is going to sacrifice the quality of this image to make it a compressed image. We can kind of help the viewer out, maybe like a 20, let's see if we push it. No, I think 40 is too much. So let's pull it back down to like 25. And now we can see those little line details in the green of these leaves, and we can see a little bit more of the crinkle and folds in the reds here on this leaf. You're never gonna see red in direct sunlight. We're gonna lose all of that information, but just underneath, we can start to see those little petal folds that make petals look so interesting. So I like that. We're gonna leave that around 25. Now, warmth is another thing that affects color space. This was taken in sunset light, which is very golden, it's very orange. So when I pull it even more, it gets kind of gross and yellowy looking, but I don't really want to back it off because I like that warm glow of sunset light, that golden hour light. So if I pull this on too far to the opposite direction, it kind of looks cold. Now this starts to look almost like an icy scene with all of these fine, tiny little details. This one I'm actually going to leave alone because I like the lighting that we had. This is just the natural lighting of the shot, and I don't really feel we need to mess with it because California can really hold your hand for some of these style photos. Ditto saturation. So if we push saturation too far, all of this starts to look really gross and hypercolor. We don't want to back it off too far because then we just have a black and white. And although this actually does look really bold as a black and white photo, I like the colors involved here. But because I said reds are a little problematic, I am going to touch this ever so slightly to the negative, like -5, -6, just to, again, help with the reds. The greens are popping beautifully, that's fine. But pulling just a little color information out of the red, I think makes them look a little bit more realistic off of what our smartphones tend to do to our JPEGs. Now, color gets us back into some of those automated filters. It's basically just what hue do you want to apply to the entire image. So if we want it to be a little colder, we can go blue, we can go green. It's sort of to replicate some of those older cameras where the exposure wouldn't be consistent or the film would get kind of messed up. We have this sort of nostalgic love for pleasantly degraded images, but I kind of like just the way the photo came out. I tend to keep my editing a bit more on the natural side. And we've got the same thing here with fade, where we can kind of mess with the overall exposure. We can kind of lighten it or fade it out. This is almost as if we were in Photoshop and we didn't have another layer underneath, but we changed this to be like 70% transparent. It's another one of those effects that I guess people like when they want to try and make a photo feel old-timey, but that's not what we're going for here, so we're gonna leave that alone. And now we get into highlights and shadows. So highlights, it's gonna take the brightest parts of your scene and make them even brighter. You can see it didn't really change anything in the background or in the shadow detail, but it really started electrifying all of the super bright parts of the scene. You really have to be careful here because you start clipping information if you push this too hard. Thankfully, we've got greens and reds, but if you had like those pale light blue flowers or whites, like if you tried to take a picture of a white rose, this would absolutely destroy information there. I'm only going to brighten it up a little bit. We're gonna hit this, say, 15. So the main body of the photo, the sort of midtones and the shadow detail are going to be left completely alone. And it's only in the sort of brightest sections of the plant that I want to bring up those levels just a little bit. And you remember, I did take the entire brightness down a notch just so I had a little more headroom to play with some of this information in here. But you know I like contrast, so I'm gonna do the opposite to shadows. If you increase the shadow detail, see, you can actually pull out some of the foliage from the shadows back here if you want to, or if that makes sense for the photo you're editing. But that, I think, makes this more distracting of a background for the plants that we're trying to play with being front and center. So the subject is this clumping of red flowers. I don't want this information to distract the eye, so I'm gonna push this in the opposite, and I'm probably gonna hit it. Oh, -30 is a little too far. Let's pull it back. Again, kind of like we did with the brightness. Let's hit it like -14, -15. Again, it's just a very subtle touch to bring out some of that subject detail, make sure the subject pops off of the background, and I like that a lot. Now, Vignette can be a great tool to help guide the eye to the subject of your photo. What it does is it creates shadow information around the corners, and it helps the center of the frame pop out. Now, if you notice, I've already kind of naturally done that with my framing. I've got shadow detail bordering 3/4 of the frame, and then this 1/4 of the frame is not too distracting. It's depth of field blurry, so we don't necessarily have to worry about this section competing with the subject. But just to show you what it might look like, it's going to make all of these sides even just a little bit darker still. So I'm gonna exaggerate it, and it really pulls that out. Now, I think this is a little too aggressive because it starts to feel like I took this photo at night with a flash. That's not really the sense that I wanna give. So I'm gonna leave Vignette alone because I think the natural framing and the sunset light and the natural shadows already do a pretty good job of popping the subject out from the background. Tilt shift is something I almost never mess with because I like to pull my depth of field directly from the camera. Basically what it does is it's going to focus on one part and blur all the rest. So I can move the focus point up here, and everything else is kind of blurry. It's helpful for faking a depth of field, but I don't particularly enjoy the effect because I think it looks super fake. And for all the parts of this frame that I want to blur, I don't want to blur these other flowers. I want to blur the background, but the background's already blurred, so I don't need to worry about it. Lastly, we've got the sharpen tool, and it does exactly what you think it would. It sharpens up some of these fine little textural details. I think smartphone cameras already apply a healthy, liberal dose of sharpening, but especially when you're zooming in, zooming out, when you're taking some of these crops, it might be helpful just to give it a little bit of a tweak. See, if I push it too far, that looks really ugly and liney and janky. And then if there's any noise in your shot, say it's a really low light shot, it's going to exacerbate your noise problems. But already this photo is pretty crisp, so I'm going to leave it alone. I think the camera did a great job of exposing it, and the contrast that we already applied and the structure that we already applied is already pulling out plenty of fine textural detail. I don't think we need to mess with artificially enhancing more of that information. So now I'm gonna hit the check mark there. Those are all of the settings that I like to go through, and you can see very subtle, fine touch adjustments one way or the other can really help you focus on the subject of your photo, pull that subject out from the rest of the background, and make for a more visually interesting composition. So let's go ahead and hit the next arrow, because I'm actually going to upload this. I like this photo. This photo is going to post to my Instagram feed. There's the photo uploaded on my Instagram channel. I'm already starting to get some likes on it, so that's cool. You already see people are starting to dig it, so that makes me feel good about myself. You got to make sure you've got all your hashtags in there, because hashtags are totes important. But looking back at the original photo, you can see it's not a profound difference. It's not like we're going for a crazy, super affected difference. It's not how I like to shoot photos. It's not how I like to edit photos. But you can still go through a number of these little settings to make sure that you're putting up some really high quality images and that you're getting the best out of your mobile photography tools. Our phone cameras are already capable of some astounding photography and video quality. So just adding in a couple little apps, or even just the built-in tools on a service like Instagram, can really help us get the most out of what we're trying to accomplish and showing off the subjects that we want to show people. So if you're sharing photos on Instagram, definitely look me up. I post as Some Audio Guy. I'm trying to see if I can get that switched over, because I own both Some Audio Guy and Some Gadget Guy, and this is just an older sort of account for me, but this is where I've got all of my followers right now. But look me up, because I am always down to share more photos and also interact with people who are also sharing photos on the interwebs. As always, folks, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hit subscribe for more tutorials like these, and I would not be able to continue producing on this channel if you all weren't out there sharing my videos on social sites like Reddit and Twitter and Facebook and the Googles Plus, and looking me up on Instagram to share some photos and videos. So please keep bringing more cool people to the party. Hit that thumbs up button, and I will catch you all on the next video.